The warm weather of early season presents some pretty significant challenges for the backcountry hunter. But in my opinion, none are more important than proper meat care in warm weather. In this video, we're going to take a look at some of the things that you can do to prevent meat spoilage so that you can get that hard-earned wild meat back to the freezer in good condition. Generally speaking, there are 3 and sometimes 4 factors that play into meat spoilage. The temperature, the moisture, bugs, and then, depending on the situation, wound channels. Let's take a look at each one of these in turn. Temperature. So under ideal conditions, meat can hang outdoors for weeks or even months with virtually no loss in quality. In fact, dry aging or hanging in a meat locker at around 38 degrees Fahrenheit for up to maybe 2 weeks or so is one of the cornerstones of quality meat care. But the mountains in September ain't no meat locker, and sometimes the temperatures can reach all the way up into the 90s, far from ideal, but if that's what it is, that's what it is. We've got to play the hand that we were dealt. Before moving on, I want to emphasize one very important point. When the weather is warm, we have a very limited window of opportunity to get this meat out in good condition. If the weather's warm, you really need to consider where you're hunting and what you're capable of. Are you going to be able to get this meat out in time? If the answer isn't a definite yes, you should probably reconsider where you're hunting or perhaps get some friends on standby to help with the pack out. In warm temperatures, and really in any temperatures as we'll see here in just a minute, the key to quality meat is getting it cooled down as quickly as possible. Although we can't control the weather, there are definitely some things that we can do to help with this. Number 1 is to get that animal field dressed ASAP. Big game like deer and elk have a lot of thermal mass, and they're not going to cool significantly until you remove the hide and they're broken down into quarters and hung up so that the meat can get airflow around it. Elk in particular are so massive and so well insulated that even in cold weather, I've seen meat spoil after a hunter failed to remove the hide and break an animal down so that the hindquarters could cool. It's most often the meat around the ball joint of the femur, where it links to the pelvis, that spoils first. This is known as bone soured. So that's the ball socket for the hip right there. There's a little tendon that runs right in the middle of it. When I cut that, this hip's gonna kind of lay back a little bit. See that? On a side note, even in weather that's cold enough to simply gut an animal and leave it there overnight to deal with the next day, especially when you're dealing with something big like elk or moose or maybe big black bears, it's important to cut down and expose those ball joints, the end of the femur, to the cold air so that that can cool down. If you leave that animal whole without exposing those ball joints, again, even in cold weather, they can bone sour because they're so well insulated and there's so much thermal mass. As you break down an animal and place those quarters in the meat bags, don't just throw the quarters on the ground or pile them up. The ground will act as an insulator. They'll cool much quicker if you find the coolest microclimate around and hang the meat until you can get it out. So worst case scenario, you're in the middle of a wide open clear cut on a south slope, it's August, it's 10 a.m. and it's only getting hotter. Here, the coolest spot might be in the shade of a leaf tree or maybe even a slash pile, and it might only be just a few degrees cooler than right out in the sun. But even under those conditions, getting the meat in the shade and hung up off the ground so that it has good airflow in it is going to allow that meat to cool much faster than simply laying it on the ground. If there's a north slope, a shaded creek, or a patch of dark timber, hang the meat there while you process the rest of the animal and pack those quarters back to the truck. If you're packing quarters and can't get everything out in one trip, remember, the sun's going to move, so be sure that that meat is going to be shaded from the time you leave with the first load until you get back for the second. Number 2, moisture. Bacteria loves warm, moist environments. Now we've already done everything that we can to help cool that meat as quickly as possible. Now we need to make sure that it dries and stays dry. When done properly, meat will develop a dry, protective rind on the surface which slows bacterial growth. This is one of the reasons that having a good quality, breathable game bag is so important. I prefer synthetic game bags like these ones from Mergali. The synthetic material is lightweight, super strong, it wicks moisture away from the meat, and it dries quickly. Be sure to hang those quarters so that they're not touching one another or other objects like a tree. This is going to allow maximum airflow. Good air circulation around the quarters is going to help them cool and dry quickly. Once they're dry, it's important to keep them dry. So if it looks like rain, either throw up a tarp, or if you don't have one, sometimes you can find a dense canopy of an evergreen and hang the quarters under there. Number 3, bugs. They can be a major nuisance when dealing with meat in the field. Yellow jackets seemingly come out of nowhere to gnaw off little chunks of meat. They're not much of a concern when it comes to meat spoilage, but they're sure a pain. Blowflies can be a problem. If meat is left uncovered, they'll find any crevice large enough to wiggle into and lay masses of eggs. Again, good game bags that close tightly at the top will solve that problem. Just make sure your game bags don't have any holes in them, because if they do, those flies will find them. And the number 4 that depends on situations, wound channels. Typically, bacterial growth is confined to the meat's surface. But when a wound channel goes through a major muscle group like a shoulder or a ham, we're effectively opening that meat up, allowing bacteria to penetrate. And because those wound channels aren't usually exposed to the cooling and drying effects of air, they tend to remain warm and moist, providing perfect conditions for rapid bacterial growth. In my experience, wound channels or otherwise bloodshot meat spoils much more rapidly than meat that's undamaged. If you find yourself dealing with this type of situation, take the time to trim away all of that damaged or bloodshot meat. You're going to have to do it anyway once you get home, so you might as well do it in the field and reduce the chances of spoilage. So that's the 3 to 4 things that contribute to meat spoilage, but there's some other things to consider, and one of them is whether or not to debone that meat. Deboning meat in the field is a great way to cut weight for pack out, but in warm weather, there's other things to consider. Just like with a wound channel, cutting into meat can potentially introduce bacteria. On the other hand, breaking a large hindquarter down into smaller muscle groups can allow that meat to cool much quicker. So what do? Personally, I virtually never debone meat in the field for many different reasons. Let's say you debone a warm elk ham. You take the muscle groups off of the bone and you throw them right into a game bag. There's a couple of problems with that. Number 1 is that you're taking all of that meat that went on the bone is kind of spread out a little bit, and you're making one giant mass out of it. That's going to hold the heat longer than if it was on the bone. And then also you've introduced bacteria between those muscle groups. They're now laying on one another, and it acts kind of like a wound channel. They stay moist, they stay warm, and that contributes to bacterial growth. So if you're going to debone, let the meat cool and then throw it into a bag. Alternatively, you could let the meat cool on the bone overnight and then debone it just before pack out the next day. So the big question is, how much time do you have? And that is a hard question to answer because it depends on so many different factors. What's the weather like? If you're getting up into the 90s during the day and you're not cooling off below the 50s at night, you'd better have a plan for getting that meat out in 24 hours or less. On the other hand, if you're experiencing highs in the 70s and lows in the 30s, it's probably getting down to maybe 34, 35 at night, and during the day it'll get up into the mid 70s. Now, these quarters have been, this will be the 3rd day. In weather like this, I probably wouldn't push it any farther than this. Now, if it was getting down to freezing at night, if it was getting down to 30 degrees and getting up to 70 or so during the day, I've actually kept quarters hanging just like this in the shade in a valley for up to 8 days, and it's just fine. Once you get that meat cooled down, it's actually pretty doggone stable. And so there's a couple of things about this, the way I've got and the place I've got these quarters hung. First of all, it's in a valley. Cold air sinks at night, and so the coldest place in the region is going to be either up on top of the mountain, which I'm not packing them up there, or down in a swale. So if you are near a creek, get your quarters down by the creek, get them on a north slope if you can do it, and keep them in the shade. Now the only thing, we're kind of in a broad valley here, so the only option that I have right here is the shade of these willows. Now we're on the north side of these willows, and I've kind of got them tucked in under here so they're shaded all day long. And plus, you know, you've got that that coolness from the air sinking at night. What it boils down to is if you can get that meat cooled down in a reasonable amount of time and then keep it cool. So long as the meat is undamaged, i.e. not bloodshot, and you can cool it down to the bone to say under 40 degrees or so, it can hang in the field for several days without issue. If you can't do that, the clock's ticking. So in conclusion, even in warm weather, there's a lot of things that you can do to prevent meat spoilage or delay it long enough to get those quarters packed out. But you need to have a plan in place for how you're going to do this. Standing over a mature bull elk in September, 8 miles from the trailhead, is not the place to start figuring this thing out. I hope everybody has a great season. Get out there, make some memories, have a great time, and we'll see you on the next one.
You almost forget how heavy elk are until you kill one every year, and then you put it on your back, and it's a good reminder that they don't get any lighter year after year. It turns out they still weigh the same.